Chapter 6 One of the Missing. A Tale from the Summer of 58. 1. They weren't all found. No, they weren't all found. And from time to time, wrong is established were made. 2. From the Derry News, June 21st, 1958, page 1. Missing boy promised new fears. Edward Law Connersons of 73 Carter Street, Derry, was reported missing last night by his mother, Monica Malican, and his stepfather, Richie P. Macklin. The connoisseur boy is 10. His disappearance has promoted new fears that Derry's young people are being stalked by a killer. Mrs. Macklin said the boy has been missing since June 19, when he failed to return home from school after the last day of classes before summer vacation. When asked why they had delay over 24 hours before reporting their son's abscess, Mr. and Mrs. Macklin refused comment. Police Chief Richard Borton also declined comment, but a police department source told the news that the concerned boy's relationship with his stepfather was not a good one and that he had spent nights out of the house. Before the source spectacular that the boy's final grades may have played a part in the boy's failure to turn up. Derry School's supplicant Harold McAuliffe declined comment on the Courage boys' grades, pointing out they are not a matter of public records. I hope the disappearance of this boy will not cause unnecessary fears, Chief Borton said last night. The mood of the community is understandably uneasy, but I want to empathize that we long 30 to 50 missing persons reports on minors each and every year. Most turn up alive and well within a week of the intentional report. This will be the case with Edward Consortin, God willing. Borton also retired in his conviction that the murder of George Debrog, Betty Ripson, Chalon Lemicons, Matthew Chalamans, and Veronica Gorgon were not the work of one person. There are assembling difference in each crime, Borton said, had declined to elaborate. He said that the local police, working in close cooperation with the mainstay authorities general's office, are still following up a number of leads. Asked in a telephone interview last night how good these leads are, Chief Borton replied, "Very good." Asked if an arrest in any of the crimes was expected soon, Borton declined comment. From the Derry News, June 22, 1958, page 1. Court orders surprise extermination. In a bizarre new twist to the disappearance of Edward Corton, Derry District Court Judge Eric K. Moulton ordered the extermination of Cort's young brother, Dorson, late yesterday. The court order followed a joint request from the country authorities and the country medical examiners, Dorsey Corton, who also lived with his mother and stepfather at 73 Carter Street, died of what were reported to be accidental causes in May of 1957. The boy was brought into the Derry Home Hospital suffering from multiple fractures, including a fracture in skull. Richard P. Malican, the boy's stepfather, was the admitted person. He stated that Dorsey's Corson had been playing on a stepladder in a garage and had apparently fallen from the top. The boy died without recovering conscious 3 days later. Edward Connersons, 10, was reported missing late Wednesday. Asked if either Mr. or Mrs. Macklin was under supplication in either the younger boy's death or the older boy's disappearance, Chief Richard Borton declined comment. From the Derry News, June 24th, 1958, page 1. Macklin arrested, beaten, death, under submission in unsolved disappearance. Chief Richard Borton of the Derry Police called a news conference yesterday to announce that Richard P. Macklin of 73 Carter Street had been arrested and charged with the murder of the stepson, Dorson Corton. The Corton boy died in Derry Home Hospital of reporting accidental cause on May 31st of last year. The medical examiner's report shows that the boy was badly beaten, Borton said. Although Macklin claimed the boy had fallen from a step land ladder while playing in the garage, Borton said the Cunton medical examiner's reports show that Dorson Corrigan was severely beaten up with some blunt instrument. When asked at what sort of instruments, Borton said, "It might have been a hammer." Right now, the important thing is the medical examiner's conclusion that this boy was struck repeated blows with some object hard enough to break his bones. The wounds, particularly those in the school, are not at all constituted with those which might be incurred. In the fall, Dorsey Corrigan was beaten within an inch of his life and then dumped off at the home hospital emergency room to die. Asked if the doctors who treated the Corrigan boy might have been derelicated in their duty when it came to reporting either an incident of child abuse or the actual cause of death, Borton said, "They will have serious questions to answer when Mr. Macklin comes to trial. As for an opinion on how these developments might bear on the recent disappearance of Dorson Corrigan's older brother, Edward, reported missing by Richard and Monica and Malakin 4 days ago," Chief Borton answered, "I think it looks much more serious than we first supposed, don't you?" From the Derry News, June 25th, 1958, page 2. Teacher says Edward Conradson's office bruise. Herentia Dumont, who teaches 5th grade at Derry Elementary School on Jackson Street, said that Edward Corrigan, who was now being missing for nearly a week, often came to school covered with bruises. Mrs. Dumont, who has taught one of Derry's 2 5th grade classes since the end of the World War II, said the concerned boy came to school one day about 3 weeks ago before his disappearance, with both eyes nearly closed shut. When I asked him what happened, he said his father had taken him up or for not eating his supper. When asked why she had not reported a beating of such obvious servations, Mrs. Dumont said, "This isn't the first time I've seen such a thing as this in my career as a teacher. The first few times I had a student with a parent who was confusing beatings with discipline, I tried to do something about it. I was told by the assistant principal, Gaylord Gendley Rayburn, in those days, to stay out of it. She told him that when school employees get involved in cases of suspected child abuse, it always comes back to haunt the school department at tax appropriation time. I went to the principal, and he told me to forget it, or I won't reminded it. I asked him if a reprimand in a matter like that would go on my records. He said a reprimand did not have to be on a teacher's record. I got the message. Asked if the attitude in the Derry school system remained the same now. Mrs. Dumont said, "Well, what does it look like in light of this current situation? And I might add that I would not be speaking to you now if I hadn't retired at the end of the school year." Mrs. Dumont went on, "Since this thing came out, I went down on my knees every night and prayed that Eddie Corrigan just got fed up with that beast of a stepfather and ran away. I pray that when he reads in the paper or hears on the news that Macklin has been locked up, Eddie will come home." In a brief telephone interview, Monica Malakin hotly refuted Mrs. Dumont's charges. Rich never beat Dorsey, and he ever beat Eddie either, she said. "I'm telling you that right now, and when I die, I'll stand at the throne of judgment and look God right in the eye and tell him the same thing." From the Derry News, June 28, 1958, page 2. "Daddy had to take me up 'cause I'm bad," told nursery teacher before beaten death. A local nursery school teacher who declined to be identified told a news reported yesterday that young Dorsey Connoisseur came to his twice-weekly nursery school class with bad sprains of his right thumb and 3 fingers of his right hand less than a week before his death in a purported garage accident. It was hurting him enough so that the poor little guy couldn't color his Mr. Deuce safety poster. The teacher said the fingers were swelled up like sausages. When I asked Dorsey what happened, he said that his stepfather, Richard P. Macklin, had bet his fingers back because he had to walk across the floor. His mother had just washed a wax. Daddy had to take me up, 'cause I'm bad, was the way he put it. I felt like crying looking at his poor dear fingers. He really wanted to color his posters like the other children, so I gave him some baby aspirin and let him color while the others were having story time. He loved to color the Mr. Do posters. That was like what he liked best. And now I'm so glad I was able to help him have a little happiness that day. When he died, it never crossed my mind to think of it was anything but an accident. I guess at first I thought he must have fallen because he couldn't grip very well with that hand. Now I think I just couldn't believe an adult could do such a thing to a little person. I know better now. I wish to God I didn't. Dorsey Corison's older brother, Edward, 10, is still missing from his cell in Derry County Jail. Richard Macklin counties to deny any part in either the death of his younger stepson or the disappearance of the older boy. From the Derry News, June 30, 1958, page 5. Macklin questions in depth of Groans Schelemans, producing unshakable alibis source claims. From the Derry News, July 6, 1958, page 1. Macklin to be charged only with murder of stepson Dorsey Borton says. Edward Corison still missing. From the Derry News, July 24th, 1958, page 1. Weeping stepfather confesses to bludgeon death of stepson. In a dramatic development in the district court trial of Richard Macklin for the murder of his stepson, Dorsey Corrigan, Macklin broke down under the Sturm Cross examination of country authorities Bradley Wissam and admitted he had beaten the 4-year-old boy to death with a Recolin's hammer, which he had then buried at the far end of his wife's vegetable garden before taking the boy to Derry Home Hospital's emergency room. The courtroom was stunned and silent as the sobbing Macklin, who had previously admitted beating both of his stepsons occasionally, if they had it coming for their own good, poured out his own story. I don't know what came over me. I saw him was climbing on the damn ladder again, and I grabbed the hammer from the bench where it was laying, and I just started to use it on him. I didn't mean to kill him with God as my witness. I never meant to kill him. Did he say anything to you before he passed out? Wissenham asked. He said, "Stop, Daddy. I'm sorry. I love you," Macklin replied. "Did you stop?" Eventually, Macklin said. He then began to weep in such a hyperbolic manner that Judge Irriton Mulliton declared the court in recess. From the Derry News, September 18, 1958, page 16. Where is Edward Corrigan? His stepfather succeeded to a term of 2 to 10 years in Shawhawk State Prison for the murder of a 4-year-old brother. Dorson continues to claim he has no idea where Edward Corison is. His mother, who was initiated divorce proceedings against Richard P. Macklin, says she thinks her soon-to-be ex-husband is lying. Is he? I, for one, really don't think so, says Father Ashley O'Brien, who serves the California prisoners at Shawshanks. Macklin began taking instructions in the Kellogg faith shortly after beginning his prison term, and Father O'Brien has spent a good deal of time with him. He was sincerely sorry for what he has done. Father O'Brien goes on, adding that when he intently asked Macklin why he wanted to be a Catholic, Macklin replied, "I hear they have an act of corsation, and I need to do a lot of that or else I'll go to hell when I die." He knows what he did to the younger boy, Father O'Brien said. If he also did something to the older one, he doesn't remember. As far as Edward goes, he believes his hands are clean. How clean Macklin's hands are in the matter of his stepson Edwards is a question which continues to trouble Derry residents, but has been conversely cleared to the other child murders which have taken here. He was able to produce and claimed Apples for the first free, and he was in jail when 7 others were committed in late June, July, and August. All 10 murders remain unsolved. In an exclusive interview with the news last week, Macklin again arrested it that he knows nothing of Edward Carrison's whereabouts. I beat them both, he said in a painful monologue which was often halted by bouts of weeping. I loved them, but I beat them. I don't know why, any more than I know why Monica let me, or why she covered up for me after Dorsey died. I guess I could have killed Eddie as easy as I did Dorsey, but I swear before God and Jesus and all the saints of heaven that I didn't. I know how it looks, but I didn't do it. I think he just ran away. If he did, that's one thing I've got to thank God for. Ask if he is aware of any gaps in his memory, if he could have killed Edward and then blocked it out of his mind, Macklin replied. I ain't aware of any gaps. I know only too well what I did. I've given my life to Christ, and I'm going to spend the rest of it trying to make up for it. From the Daily News, January 27, 1960, page 1. Body not that of Carrison, young Borton announces. Police Chief Richard Borton told reporters earlier today that the badly decomposed body of a boy about the age of Edward Carrison, who disappeared from his Derry home in June of 1958, is definitely not that of that missing youth. The body was found in Ashford, Massachusetts, buried in the gravel pit. Both Maine and Massachusetts state police at first theorized that the body might be that of the concerned boy, believing that he might have been picked up by a child molester after running away from the Carter Street home where his young brother had been beaten and killed. Dental charts showed conclusively that the body found in Ansford was not that of the concerned youth, who was now been missing for 19 months. From the Portland Press Herald, July 19, 1967. Page 3. Convicted murderer commits suicide in Falmouth. Richard P. Macklin, who was convicted to the murder of 4-year-old stepson 9 years ago. He was found dead in a small third-floor Falmouth apartment late yesterday afternoon. The Perlin, who had lived and worked quietly in Falmouth since his release from the Shawshank State Prison in 1964, was an apartment suicide. The note he left indicated in an extremely confused state of mind. Assistant Falmouth Police Chief Brandon K. Roach said he refused to divulge the note contents, but a police department source said it consisted of 2 sentences. I saw Eddie last night. He was dead. The Eddie referred to may well have been Macklin's stepson, brother of the boy Macklins, was convicted of killing in 1958. It was disappearance of Edward Carrison, which eventually led to Macklin's conviction for the beaten death of Edward's younger brother, Dorsey. The elder boy has been missing for 9 years. In a brief court proceeding in 1966, the boy's mother had her son declared legally dead so she could enter into possession of Edward Carrison's savings account. The account contained a sum of $16. 3. Eddie Corcoran was dead all right. He died on the night of June 19, and his stepfather had nothing at all to do with it. He died as Ben Hanscom sat home watching TV with his mother, as Eddie Kasprak's mother anxiously felt Eddie's forehead for signs of her favorite ailment, phantom fever, as Beverly Marsh's stepfather, a gent who bored and temperated as least a remarkable resemblance to Eddie and Dorsey's co-recordant stepfather, lifted a high-stepping kick into the girl's dinner and told her to get out there and dry those goddamn dishes like your mummer told you, as Mike Hanlon got yelled at by some high school boys. One of whom would some years later sire that fine upstanding young homophone, John Webby Garton, passing in an old Dodge, while Mike pulled weeds out of the garden beside the small Hanlon home out on the Windham Road, not far from the farm owned by Henry Bowers' crazy father, as Richie Torsler was sneaking a look at the half-undressed girls in the copy of Jem he had found at the bottom of his father's socks and underwear drawer, and getting a regular good boner. And as Bill Deprog was throwing his dead brother's photograph album across the room in horrified unbelief, although none of them would remember doing so later, all of them looked up at the exact moment Eddie Corrigan died, as if hearing some distance cry. The news had been absolutely right about one thing. Eddie's rank card was just bad enough to make him afraid to go home and face his stepdad. Also, his mother and the old man were fighting a lot this month. That made things even worse. When they got going at it in the hot and heavy, his mother shouted a lot of mostly incursions. His stepdad responded to this first with gruts, then yells to shut up, and finally with the enraged bellows of a boar, which has gotten a quiver of porcupine needless in its snout. Eddie had never seen the old man use his fists on her. Through, Eddie didn't think he quite dared. He had saved his fists for Eddie and Dorsey in the old days, and now that Dorsey was dead, Eddie got his little brother's share as well as his own. These shouting matches came and went in cycles. They were most common at the end of the month when the bills came in. A policeman called by a neighbor might drop by once or twice when things were at their worst and tell them to tone it down. Usually that ended it. His mother was adept to give him the finger and dare him to take her in, but his stepdad rarely said boo. His stepdad wasn't afraid of the cops. Eddie thought he lay low during those periods of stress. It was wiser. If you didn't think so, just look at what had happened to Dorsey. Eddie didn't know the specific and didn't want to, but he had an idea about Dorsey. He thought that Dorsey had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the garage. On the last day of the month, they told Eddie that Dorsey fell off the stepladder in the garage. If I told him once to stay off it, I told him 60 times, his stepdad had said, but his mother wouldn't look at him except by accident. And when their eyes did meet, Eddie had seen a frightened, ratty little glim in hers that he didn't like. The old man just sat there silently at the kitchen table with a quarter of original gold, looking at nothing from beneath his heavy lowering eyebrows. Eddie kept out of his reach. When his stepfather was below him, he was usually, not always, but usually all right. It was when he stopped that you had to be careful. 2 nights ago, he had thrown a chair at Eddie when Eddie got up to see what was on the other TV channel. Just picked up one of the Trembler Lion kitchen chairs, swept it back over his hand, and let fly. It hit Eddie in the butt and knocked him over. His butt still ached, but he knew it could have been worse. It could have been his head. Then there had been the night when the old man had suddenly gotten up and rubbed a handful of mashed potatoes into Eddie's hair for no reason at all. One day last September, Eddie had come in from school and foolishly allowed the screen door to slam shut behind him while his stepdad was taking a nap. Macklin came out of the bedroom in his Billio boxer shorts, hair standing up in the corkscrews, cheeks grizzled with 2 days of weakened beard, brief grizzled with 2 days of weakened beard. There now, Eddie, he said, I got to take you up for slamming that fucking door. And Rich Macklin's Lennox, taking you up, was emphasis for, beating the shit out of you, which was what he then did to Eddie. Eddie had lost concentration. When the old man threw him into the front hall, his mother had mounted a pair of low caw hooks out there, especially for him and Dorsey, to hang their coats on these hooks, and rammed hard steel fingers into Eddie's lower back, and that was when he passed out. When he came to 10 minutes later, he heard his mother yelling that she was going to take Eddie to the hospital, and he couldn't stop her. After what happened to Dorsey, his stepdad had responded, "You want to go to jail, woman?" That was the end of her talk about the hospital. She helped Eddie into his room, where he laid shivering on his bed, his forehead beneath his sweat. The only time he left the room during the next 3 days was when they were both gone, when he would hobble slowly into the kitchen, groaning softly, and get his stepdad's whiskey from under the sink. A few nips pulled the pain. The pain was mostly gone by the 5th day, but he had pissed blood for almost 2 weeks, and the hammer wasn't in the garage anymore. What about that? What about that friends and neighbors? Oh, the craftsman's hammer, the ordinary hammer, was still there. It was the Scott and Recolinus which was missing. His stepdad's special hammer, the one he had in Dorsey, had been forbidden to touch. If you of you touches that baby, he had told them the day he brought it, you'll both be wearing your guts for earmuffs. Dorsey had asked timidly if that hammer was very expensive. The old man told him he was damn tootin'. He said it was filled with ball bearings, and you couldn't make it bounce back up no matter how hard you brought it down. Now it was gone. Eddie's grades weren't the best because he had missed a lot of school since his mother remarried. But he was not a stupid boy by any means. He thought he knew what had happened to the Scotty Recolinus hammer. He thought maybe his stepfather had used it on Dorsey and then buried it in the garden, or maybe thrown it in the canal. It was the sort of thing that happened frequently in the horror comics Eddie read, the ones he kept on the top shelf on his closet. He walked closer to the canal, which rippled between its considerate sides like oiled slick. A swatch of moonlight glimmered across its dark surface in a boomerang shape. He sat down, swinging his sneakers idly against the carton in an irregular tattoo. The last 6 weeks had been quite dry, and the water followed past perhaps 9 feet below the worn swole of his sneakers. But if you look closely at the canal side, you could read the various levels to reach it sometimes rose quite easily. The consider was stained a dark brown just above the water's current level. This brown stain slowly faded to yellow, then to a color that was almost white at the level where the heels of Eddie's sneakers made contact when he swung them. The water flowed smoothly and silent out of a concert arch that was cobbled on the inside, past the place where Eddie sat, and then down to the covered wooden footbridge between Basie Park and Derry High School. The bridge's sides and planked footing, even the beams under the roof, were covered with an entourage of initial phone numbers and declination of love, declination that so-and-so was willing to suck or blow, declination that those discovered sucking or blowing would lose their foreskins or have their assholes plugged with hot tar. Occasionally interned a declaration that defined definition, one that Eddie had puzzled over. All these spring read have saved Russian Jews, collect valuable prizes. What exactly did that mean? Anything. And did it matter? Eddie didn't go into the Kissin Bridge tonight. He had no urge to cross over to the high school side. He had thought he would probably sleep in the park, maybe in the dead leaves, under the bandstand, but for now it was fine just to sit there. He liked it in the park and came often when he had to think. Sometimes there were people making out in the grooves of trees which dotted the park, but Eddie left them alone, and they left him alone. He had heard learned stories in the playground at the school about the queers that cruised in Basie Park after sundown, and he accepted their stories about questions. But he himself had never been bothered. The park was a peaceful place, and he had thought the best part of it was right here where he was sitting. He liked it in the middle of summer, When the water was so low, it chuckled over the stones and actually broke up into isolated streamlets that twisted and turned and sometimes came together again. He liked it in late March or early April, just after ice out, when he would sometimes stand by the canal. Too cold to sit then, your ass would freeze for an hour for more. The hood of his old parquet, now 2 years too small for him, pulled up, his hands plugged into his pockets, unaware that his skinny body was shivering and shaking. The canal had a terrible instrumental power. In the week or two after the ice went down, he was fascinated by the way the water boiled whitely out of the cobble arch and roared past him, bearing sticks and branches and all manner of human trash along with it. More than once he had Averi's walking beside the canal in March with his stepdad and given the bastard a great big motherfucking push. He would scream and fall in, his arm pinwheeling for balance, and Eddie would stand on the currents and parapet and watch him carried off downstream, his head a black bobbin shape in the middle of the unruly white-caped current. He would stand there, yes, and he would cup his hands around in his mouth and scream, "That was for Dorsey, you rotten cocksucker! When you get down to hell, tell the devil the last thing you ever heard was me telling you to pick on somebody your own size." It would never happen, of course, but it was absolutely grand fantasy, a grand dream to dream as you sat here by the canal, a hand close about Eddie's foot. He had been looking across the canal toward the school, smiling a sleepy, a rather beautiful smile, as he imagined his stepfather being carried off in the violent rip of the spring runoff, being carried out of his life forever. The soft yet strong grip startled him so much that he almost lost his balance and tumbled in the canal. It's one of the cores the big kids are always talking about, he thought, and then he looked down. His mouth dropped open, urine spilled hotly down his legs and stained his jeans black in the moonlight. It wasn't Quir, it was Dorsey. It was Dorsey as he had been buried, Dorsey in his blue blazer and gray pants. Only now the blazer as was in muddy tatters. Dorsey's shirt was yellow rags. Dorsey's pants clucked wetly to legs as thin as broomsticks, and Dorsey's head was horribly slubbed as if it had been craved in the back and consciously pushed in the front. Dorsey was grinning. "Eddie!" His dead brother croaked just like one of the dead people who were always coming back from the grave in the horror comics. Dorsey's grin widened, yellow teeth gleamed, and somewhere back in the darkness things seemed to be squirming. "Eddie, I came to see you, Eddie." Eddie tried to scream. Waves of gray shock rolled over him, and he had the curses sensation that he was floating, but it was not a dream. He was awake. The hand on the sneaker was as white as a trout's belly. His brother's bare feet clung somehow to the concern. Something had bitten one of Dorsey's heels off. "Come on down, Eddie." Eddie couldn't scream. His lungs didn't have enough air in them to manage a scream. He got out a curious reading moaning sound. Anything louder seemed beyond him. That was all right in a second or two. His mind would snap, and after that, nothing would matter. Dorsey's hand was small, but intactical. Eddie's buttocks were sliding over the concern to the edge of the canal. Still making that reedy moaning sound, he reached behind himself and grabbed the concern edging and yanked himself backward. He left the hand side away more intently, heard an angry hiss, and had time to think. "That's not Dorsey. I don't know what it is, but it's not Dorsey." Then adrenaline flooded his body, and it was crawling away, trying to run even before he was on his feet. His breath coming in, short, shrinkly whistles. White hands appeared on the concerned lips of the canal. There was wet slapping sound. Drops of water flew upward in the moonlight from dead, pallid skin. Now Dorsey's face appeared over the edge, dim red. Sparks gleamed in the sunken eyes. His wet hair was pleasured in his skull, mud-streaked. his cheeks like war paint. Eddie's chest finally unlocked. He hitched in breath and turned it into a scream. He got it to his feet and ran. He ran looking back over his shoulder, needed to see where Dorsey was, and as a result, he ran smack into a large elm tree. It felt as if someone, his old man, for instance, had set off a diamanted charge on a left shoulder. Stars shot of corkscrews through his head. He fell at the base of the tree as if Pollock's blood trickling from his left temple. He swam in the water of the summer kitchen for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he managed to gain his feet again. A groan escaped him as he tried to raise his left arm. It didn't want to come. Felt all numb and far, so he raised his right and rubbed his fiercely aching head. Then he remembered why he had happened to run full tilt into the elm tree in the first place and looked around. There was the edge of the canal, white as bone and straight as string in the moonlight. No sign of the thing from the canal. If there ever had been a thing, he continued turning, working his way slowly through a completed 360 degrees. Basin Park was silent and as still as a black and white photograph. Weeping willows draggled their thin, tremulous arms, and anything could be standing slumped and insane within their shelter. Eddie began to walk, trying to look everywhere at once. His strained shoulder throbbed in painful sync with his heartbeat. "Eddie!" The breeze moaned through the trees. "Don't you want to see me, Eddie?" He felt flabby corpse fingers crease the side of his neck. He whirled his hands, going up, as his feet tangled together, and he saw that it had only been willow frauds moving in the breeze. He got up again. He wanted to run, but when he tried, another dynamite charge went off in his shoulder, and he had to stop. He knew somehow that he should be getting over his fright by now, calling himself a stupid little baby who got spooked by a reflection, or maybe fell asleep without knowing it, and had a bad dream that wasn't a pennon through quite the reverse. In fact, his heart was now beating so fast he could no longer discriminate the separate thuds, and he felt sure it would soon burst in terror. He couldn't run, but when he got out of the willows, he did manage a lippin' jog trot. He fixed his eyes on the street light that marked the park's main gates. He headed in that direction, managing a little more speed, thinking, "I'll make it to the light, and that's all right. I'll make it to the light, and that's all right. Bright light, no more fright. Up all night." What a sight. Something was following him. Eddie could hear it, bludgeoning its way through the willow groove. If he turned, he would see it. It was gaining. It could hear its feet, a kind of shuffling, squitchling stride, but he would not look back. No, he would look again at the light. The light was all right. He would just continue his flight to the light. And he was almost there. Almost. The smell was what made him look back. The overwhelming smell, as if fish had been left to not rot in a huge pile that had become curiously slushy in the summer heat. It was the smell of a dead ocean. It was Dorsey after him now. It was the creature from the Black Lorrigan. The thing's snot was long and pleated. Green fluid dripped from black lashes like vertical mouths in its cheeks. Its eyes were white and jelly-like. Its webbed fingers were tipped with claws like razors. Its reputation was bubbly and deep. The sound of a diver with a bag replicator, as if saw Eddie looking, its green-black lips wriggling back from huge fangs in a dead and vacant smile. It sambled after him, dripped, and Eddie suddenly understood. It meant to take him back to the canal, to carry him down into the dank blackness of the canal's underground passage, to eat them there. Eddie put on a burst of speed. The arc saw them in light. At the gate, drew closer. He could see its hollow of bugs and moths. A truck went by, heading for Route 2, the driver working his way up through the gears, and it crossed Eddie's desperate, terrified mind that he could be drinking coffee from a paper cup and listening to a Buddy Holly tune on the radio, completely unaware that less than 200 yards away there was a boy who might be dead in another 20 seconds. The overwhelming stink of it, gaining all around him. It was a park bench he tripped over. Some kind had casually pushed it over earlier that evening, heading toward their home at a run to beat the curfew. Its seat poked an inch or two out of the grass, one shades of green on other, almost invisibly. In the most driven dark, the edge of the seat smacked Eddie in the shins, causing a burst of glassing excruciating pain. His legs flipped out behind him, and he thumped into the grass. He looked behind him and saw the creature bearing down, its white poached egg eyes glittering, its scales dripping slime the color of seaweed. The gills up and down its bugling neck, and cheeks opening and closing. "Ack!" Eddie croaked. It seemed to be the only noise he could make. "Ack! Ack! Ack! Ack!" He crawled now, fingers hooking deep into the turf. His tongue hung out in the second before the creature's fish-smelling, horny hands closed around his throat. A comforting through came to him. This is it. A dream. It has to be. There is no real creature, no real black ligan, and even if there was a South American or the Florida Everglades or someplace like that. This is only a dream, and I'll wake up in my bed or maybe in the leaves under the bandstand, and the Bacterian hands closed around his neck, and Eddie's hoarse cries were choked off as the creature turned him over. The carnation hooks wish sprouted from those hands, scrawled bleeding marks like chirographic into his neck. He started into its glowing white eyes. He felt the webs between its fingers pressing against his throat like considering bands of living seaweed. His terror-sharpened gaze noted the fin, something like a rooster combed and something like a horpritz, poisonous back fin, standing atop the creature's hunch and plated head as its hands clamped tight, shutting off its air. He was even able to see the way the white light from the arc Solomon lamp turned a smoky green as it passed through the Manbor's head thing. "You're not real," Eddie choked, but clouds of grayness was closing in now, and he realized faintly that it was real enough. This creature, it was after all killing him, and yet some radiantly remained even until the end, as the creature hooked its claws into the soft ment of his neck, as his carroted Aratum let go in a warm, painless gout that splashed the fangs, replet and plaited. Eddie's hands groped at the creature's back, feeling for a zipper. They fell away only when the creature tore his head from his shoulder with a low, satisfied grunt, and as Eddie's picture of what it was began to fade, it began promptly to change into something else. 4. Unable to sleep, plagued by bad dreams, a boy named Michael Hanlon rose soon after first light on the first full day of summer vacation. The light was pale, bundled up in a low, thick mist that would lift by 8 o'clock, taking the wraps off a perfect summer day. But that was for later. For now, the world was all gray and rose, as silent as a cat walking on a carpet. Mike, dressed in a corridor, a t-shirt, a black high-topped Ken's, came downstairs, ate a bowl of Wheaties. He didn't really like Wheaties. He had wanted to free price in a box, a Captain Midnight magic decoder and ring, then Hope on his bike and pedaled toward town, riding on the sidewalks. Because of the fog changed everything, made the most ordinary things like the fire heights and stop signs into the objects of mystery, things both strange and the trifle sinister. You could hear cars, but not see them. And because of the fog's old acoustics quality, you could not tell if they were far or near until you actually saw them come rolling out of the fog with ghost hollows of moisture ringing their headlamps. He turned right on Jackson Street, bypassing downtown, and then crossed to Main Street by way of Plummer Lane. And during his short ride down this little byways, 1 block ledge. He passed the house where he would live on his adult. He did not look at it. It was just a small 2-story dwelling with a garage and small lawn. It gave off no special vibration to the passing boy who would spend most of his adult life as its owner and dweller. At Main Street, he turned right and roped down to the Basie Park, still wondering, simply riding and enjoying the stillness of the early day. Once inside the main gate, he dismounted his bike, pushed down the kickstand, and walked toward the canal. He was still, as far as he knew, impaled by nothing more than pursuit whim. Certainly it did not occur to him to think that his dreams of the night before had exactly to do with his certain course. He did not even remember exactly what his dreams had been, only that one had followed another until he had awakened at 5 o'clock, sweaty but shivering, and with the idea that he ought to eat a fast breakfast and then take a bike ride into the town. Here in Basie, there was a smell in the fog. He didn't like a seat smelly, salty, and old. He had smelled it before, of course, in the early morning fogs. You could often smell the ocean in Derry, although the coast was 40 miles away. But the smell this morning seemed thicker, more vital, almost dangerous. Something caught his eyes. He bent down and picked up a cheap 2-blade pocket knife. Someone had scratched the initials EC on the side. Mike looked at it thoughtfully for a moment or two and then at pocket. Finders keepers, losers weepers. He glanced around here near where he had found the knife was an overturned park bench. He righted it, setting its iron footings back into the hole. Then had made over a period of month or year. Beyond the bench he saw a matted place in the grass, and leading away from it, 2 grooves. The grass was springing back up, but those grooves were still fairly clear. They went in the direction of the canal, and there was blood. The bird remembered but he did not want to remember the bird, so he pushed the thought away. Dog fight, that's all. One of them must have hurt the other one pretty bad. It was convincing, though, thought by which he was somehow not convinced. Thoughts of the bird kept wanting to come back. The one he had seen at the Creature Ironworks, one Stan Eris never would have found in his bird box. Stop it! Just get out of there! But instead of getting out, he followed the groove. As he neared, he made up a little story in his mind. It was a murder story. Here's this kid out late. See, out or past the Crufer. The killer gets him. And how does he get rid of the body? Drags it to the canal and dumps it in, of course. Just like Alfred Hitrock presents. The marks he was following could have been made by a dragon pair of shoes or sneakers. He supposed. Mike shivered and looked around uncertainly. The story was somehow a little too real. And supposed that it wasn't a man who did it, but a monster, like out of a horror comic or a horror book or a horror movie or a bad dream, a fairy or something. He decided he didn't like the story. It was a stupid story. He tried to push it out of his mind, but it wouldn't go. So what? Let it stay. It was dumb. Riding into this morning had been dumb. Following these 2 matted grooves in the grass was dumb. His dad would have a lot of chores for him to do around the place today. He ought to get back and start in, or when the hottest part of the afternoon rolled around, he wouldn't be up the barn loft pitching hay. Yes, he ought to get back, and that's just what he was going to do. Sure you are, he thought. Want to bet? Instead of going back to his bike and getting on in a riding home and starting his chores, he followed the groove in the grass. There were more drops of drying blood here and there. Not much through, not as much as there had been in the matted place. Back there by the park bench he had set to rights. Mike could hear the canal now, running quiet. A moment later he saw the Currency edge, artificial out of the fog. Here was something else in the grass. My goodness, it's certainly your day for finding things, his mind said, was dumping in this generally, and then a gull screamed somewhere, and Mike flinched, thinking again of the bird he had seen that day just this spring, whenever that is in the grass. I don't even want to look at it. and that oh so very true. But here he was, already bending over it, hands planted just above his knees, to see what it was. A tattering bit of clothes with a drop of blood on it. The seagull screamed again. Mike started at the bloody scrap of clothes and remember what happened to them in the spring. 5. Each year during April and May, the Hanlon farm woke up from its winter doze. Mike would let himself know that spring had come again, not when the first cook horses showed under his mom's kitchen, the windows, or when kids started bringing almonds and crackers to school, or even when the Washington Senators kicked off the baseball season, unusually getting themselves shackled in the process, but only when his father hollered for Mike to help him push their monocule truck out of the barn. The front half was an old model of Ford car, the back end a pickup truck with a tailgate, which was the reminder of the old henhouse door. If the winter hadn't been too cold, the two of them could often get it going by pushing it down the driveway. The truck's cab had no doors. Likewise, there was no windshield. That seat was half of an old soft sofa, what Will Hanlon had scrounged from the dairy dump. The stick shift ended at glass doorknob. They would push it down the driveway, one of the each sides, and when it got rolling good, Will would jump in, turn on the switch, retard the spark, step down on the clutch, punch the shift into the first gear with his big hand clumped over the doorknob. Then he would holler, "Put me over the hump." He'd pop the clutch, and the old Ford in Gyn would cough, choke, chug, backfire, and something actually start to run, rough at first, then smoothing out. Will would roar down the road toward Rowland Farms, turn around in their driveway. If he had gone the other way, Henry Bowers' crazy father Butch probably would have blown his head off with a shotgun, and then roared back the unmuffled engine, blad and stridently, while Mike jumped up and down and with excitement and cheering, and his mom stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on the dish towel and pretended the disgust she didn't really feel. Other times the truck wouldn't roll start and Mike would have to wait until his father came back from the barn, carrying the crank and muttering under his breath. Mike was quite sure that some of the words so muttered were swears, and he would be a little frightened, and his daddy then. It wasn't until much later, during one of those interminable visits to the hospital room where Will Hanlon lay dying, that he found out his father muttered because he was afraid of the crank. Once it had kicked back viciously, flown out of its socket, and tore the side of his mouth open. "Stand back, Mikey," he would say, slipping the crank into its socket at the base of the radiator. And when the A was finally running, he'd say that next year he was going to trade it for a Chevrolet. But he never did. That old A Ford Highbird was still in back of the home place, up to its axles and henhouse tailgate and weeds, when it was running, and Mike was sitting in the passenger seat, smelling hot oil and blue exhaust, excited by the keen breeze that washed him through the glasses hole where the windshield had once been. He would think spring's here again. We're all waking up, and in his soul he would raise a silent cheer that shook the walls of that mostly cheerful room. He felt love for everything around him, and most of all for his dad, who would grin over at him and holler, "Hold on, Mikey, we gon' win this baby up. We gon' make some birds run for cover." Then he would tear up the driveway, the A's rear wheels spinning back black dirt and gray clouds of clay of both of them jouncing up and down on the sofa seat inside the open cab, laughing like stark, natural-born fools. Will would run the A through the high grass of the backfield, which was kept for the hay, toward either the south field, potatoes, the west field, corn and beans, or the east field, peas and squash and pumpkins. As they went, birds would burst up out of the grass before the truck, squawking in terror. Once a parrot flew up, and magnificent bird as brown as late autumn oaks. The explosive coffin whir of its wings audible even over the pounding engine. Those ride were Mike Hanlon's door into spring. The year's work began with the rock harvest. Every day for a week, they would take the A out a load the bed with rocks which might break a hollow blade when the time came to turn the earth and plant. Sometimes the truck would get stuck in the mucky spring earth, and Will would mutter darkly under his breath. More swears. Mike's surprising. He knew some of the words expression utters, such as son of a whore, puzzled him. He had come across the word in the Bible, and so far as he could tell, a whore was a woman who came from a place called Babylon. He had once set out to ask his father, but the A had been in mud up in her coil springs. There had been thunderclouds on his father's brow, and he had decided to wait for a better time. He ended up asking Richie Torzor later that year, and Richie told him his father had told him a whore was a woman who got paid for having sex with men. What's having sex? Mike asked, and Richie had wandered away, holding his head. On one occasion, Mike had asked his father why, since they harvest rocks every April, there were always more of them the following April. They had been standing at the dumping off place near sunset on the last day of that year's rocks harvest. A beaten dirt track, not quite serious enough to call a road, led from the bottom of the west field to this gully near the bank of the Kensdick. The gully was a jumbled wasteland of rocks that had been dragged off Will's land through the years, looking down at the Badlands, which he had made first alone, and then with the help of his son. Somewhere under the rocks he knew where the rotten remains of the stumps he had yanked out one at a time before any of the fields could be tilled. Will had lighted a cigarette and said, "My daddy used to tell me that God loved rocks, house fields, weeds, and poor people above all the rest of his creations, and that's why he made so many of them. But every year it's like they come back." "Yeah, I think they do," Will said. "That's the only way I know to explain it." A loon cried from the far side of the Kenstrick in the dusky sunset that had turned the water a deep orange red. It was a lonely sound, so lonely that it made Mike's tired arms tightened with goose flesh. "I love you, Daddy," he said suddenly, feeling his love so strongly that tears struck his eyes. "Why, I love you too, Mikey," his father said, and hugged him tight in his strong arms. Mike felt the rough fabric of his father's flannel shirt against the cheek. "Now what do you say we go on back? We got just time to get a bath each before the good woman puts supper on the table." Mike said. Yourself," Will Hanlon said, and they both laughed, feeling tired, but feeling good. Arms and legs, work, but not overwork. Their hands, roughened, but not hurting too bad. "Spring's here," Mike thought that night, drowsing off in his room, while his mother and father watched the honeymooners in the other room. "Spring's here again. Thank you, God. Thank you very much." And turning to sleep, sinking down, he had heard the loon call again. The distance of its marshes blending into the desire of his dreams. Spring was a busy, but it was a good time. Following the rock harvest, Will would prank the A in the high grass back end of the house and drive the tractor out of the barn. There would be a heroine then. His father driving the tractor, Mike either riding behind and holding on to the iron seat, or walking alongside, picking up any rocks they had missed and throwing them aside. Then came planting, and following the planting came summer's work. Hoeing. His mother would refurbish Larry, Moe, and Curly their free scarecrows, and Mike would help his father put moose blowers on top of each straw-filled head. A moose blower was a can with both ends cut off. You tied a ledge of heavily waxed and rosin string tightly across the middle of the can, and when the wind blew through it, what a wonderful spooky sound resulted in a kind of winning croak. Cropping and birds decided soon enough that Larry, Moe, and Curly were no threats, but the moose blowers always frightened them off. Starting in July, there was picking as well as hoeing, peas and radishes first, then the lettuce and the tomatoes that had been started in the shed boxes. Then the corn and beans in August, more corn and beans in September. Then the pumpkins and the squash. Somewhere in the midst of all that came the new potatoes. And then, as the day shortened and the air sharpened, he had and his dad would take in the moose blowers. And sometimes during the winter, they would disappear. It seemed they had to make new ones each spring. The day after, Will would call Norman Saddler, who was as dumb as his son, Moose, but infinitely more good-hearted. And Norrie would come over with his potato digger. For the next 3 weeks, all of them would work picking potatoes in addition to the family. Will would hire 3 or 4 high school boys to help pick, paying them a quarter a barrel. The A Ford would cruise slowly up and down the rows of the south field, the biggest field, always in low gear, the tailgate down, the black field with barrels, each marked with the name of the person picking into it. And at the end of the day, Will would open his old creased wallet and pay each of the pickers cash money. Mike was paid, and so was his mother. That money was theirs, and Will Hanlon never once asked either of them what they did with it. Mike had been given a 5% interest in the farm when he was 5 years old enough. Will had told him then to hold a hoe and to tell the difference between witchgrass and pea plants. Each year he had been given another 1%, and each year on the day after Thanksgiving, Will would compute it in the farm's profit and deduct Mike's share, but Mike never saw any of that money. It went into this college account and was to be touched under absolutely no other circumstances. At last the day would come when Norrington Saddler drove his photo digger back home. By then the air would have most likely turned gray and cold and there would be frost on the drift of orange pumpkins piled against the side of the barn. Mike would stand in the dooryard, his nose red, his dirty hands stuffed into his jeans pocket, and watch his father drove first the tractor and then the A Ford back into the barn. He would think we're going ready and go to sleep. Spring vanished, summer gone, harvest time done. All that was left now was the butt end of autumn, leafless trees, frozen ground, a lacing of ice along the banks of the Kanzak in the fields. Crowns would sometimes land on the shoulders of Moe, Larry, and Curly, and stay as long as they like. The scarecrows were voiceless, fretless. Mike would not exactly be dismayed by another year ending. At 9 and 10, he was still too young to make mortal metaphors, because there was plenty to look forward to. Sledding in McCarran Park, or on Rublin Hill, out there in Derry Town, if you were brave, although that was mostly for big kids. Ice skating, snowball fights, snow forts, building. There was time to think about snowshoeing out for a Christmas tree with his daddy, and time to think about the Northern downhill skits he might or might not get for Christmas winter was good, but watching his father drive the A back into the barn, spring vanished, summer gone, harvest time done, always made him feel sad. The way the skeletons of birds heading south for the winter made him feel sad, or the way or certain slant of light could sometimes make him feel like crying for no good reason. We're getting ready to go to sleep again. It was not all school and chores in school. Will Hanlon had told his wife more than once that a boy needed time to go fishing, even if it wasn't fishing he was really doing. When Mike came home, when Mike came home from school, he was put his books on the TV in the parlor a second, made himself some kind of snack. He was particularly into peanut butter and onion sandwiches, a taste that made his mother raise her hands in helpless horror. A third study, though his father had left, telling him where he will was and what Mike's chores were. Certain rows to be weeded or picked, baskets to be carried, produced, and to be rotated, the barn to be swept, whenever, but on at least one schoolday a week, and sometimes two. There would be no, and on these days Mike would go fishing, even if it wasn't really fishing he was doing. Those were great days when he had no particular place to go and continuously felt no urge to get there in a hurry. Once in a while, his father left him another sort of note. No chores, one might say. Go over to Old Cape to look at trolley tracks. Mike would go over to the Old Cape arena, find the streets with the tracks still unbended in them, and inspect them closely, marveling to think of things like trains that had run right through the middle of the streets. That night he had and his father might talk about them, and his dad would show him pictures from his diary album of the trolleys up to the electrical wire, and there were cigarette ads on the side. Another time he had sent Mike in Merle Park, where the sandpipe was, to look like at the bird bath, and once they had gone to the courthouse together to look at a terrible machine that Chief Borton that had found in the attic. This gadget was called a tramp chair. It was a cast iron, and there were meticulously built into the arms and legs rounded knobs stuck out of the back and seat. It reminded Mike of the photographs he had seen in some books, in a photograph of the electric chair, of Sing Sing. Chef Borton let Mike sit in the tramp chair and the manacles. After the first ominous novelty of wearing the manacles wore off, Mike looked questioningly at his father and Chief Borton, not sure why this was supposed to be such a horrible punishment for the Vags. Borton's words for them, that had drifted into town in the 20s and 30s. The knobs made the chair a little uncomfortable to sit in, sure, and the manacles are your wrists and ankles made it hard to shift into a more comfortable position. But before the sun, a great shudder of shadow would travel slowly across the field. But, well, you're just a kid, Chef Borton said, laughing. What do you weigh? 70, 80 pounds? Most of the Vag Sheriff Solely posted into that chair. In the old days, would you go twice that? They feel a bit uncomfortable after an hour or so, really uncomfortable after 2 or 3, and right bad after 4 or 5, after 7 or 8 hours. They state Ballarin, and after 16 or 17, they start crying mostly, and by the time their 24-hour tour was up, they've been willing to swear before God and man that the next time they came right in the nods, New England way, they give dairy a wide beneath. So far as I know, most of them did. 24 hours in the tramp chair was a hell of a parsunder. Suddenly, there seemed to be more knobs in the chair digging more deeply into his buttocks. Spine, the small of his back, even the nape of his neck, Can I get out now, please? He said particularly, and Chef Borton laughed again. There was a moment, one panic and state of time, when Mike, through the chief, would only dangle the key to the manacles in front of Mike's eyes and say, "Sure, I'll let you out when your 24 hours is up." "Why did you take care, Daddy?" he asked on the way home. "You'll know when you're older," Will had replied. "You don't like Chief Borton, do you?" "No," his father had replied in a voice so curt that Mike hadn't dared ask any more. But Mike enjoyed most of his places in Derry. His father sent or took him to, and by the time Mike was 10, Will had succeeded in conveying his own interest in the layers of Derry's history to his son, sometimes as when he had been trailing his fingers over the silently pebbled surface of the stand in which the Memorial Park bird bath was set, or when he had squatted down to look more closely at the trolley tracks which grooved Mont Street in the old Cape, he would been struck by a profound sense of time. Time was something real, as something that had been unseen. Weight, the way sunlight was supposed to have weight. Some of the kids in school had laughed when Mrs. Greenis told them that, but Mike had been too stunned by the concept to laugh. His first through had been light as weight. "Oh, my Lord, that's terrible." That as something that would eventually bury him. The first note his father left him in that spring of 1958 was scribbled on the back of the envelope and held down with a slat shaker. The air was spring warm, wonderfully sweet, and his mother had opened all the windows. No cores. The note read, "If you want to ride your bike at the Pacific Road, you'll see a lot of tumbled, mastering and old machinery out in the field on your left. Have a look around. Bring back a souvenir. Don't go near the cellar hole. And be back before dark." Sorry about that. You know why? Mike knew all right. Mike knew why, all right. He told his mother where he was going, and she frowned. "Why don't you see if Randy Robinson wants to go with you?" "Yeah, okay, I'll stop by and ask him," Mike said. He did too, but Randy had gone up to Bangor with his father to buy seedling potatoes, so Mike rode his bike over to Pacific Road alone. It was a goodish ride, a little over 4 miles. Mike reckoned it was 3 o'clock by the time he leaned his bike against an old wooden shelf fence on the left side of Pacific Road and climbed into the field beyond him. He would have maybe an hour to explore, and then he would have to start home again. Ordinarily, his mother would not be upset with him as long as he was back by 6, when she put the dinner on the table. But one memorable episode was taught him that wasn't the case this year. One that occasionally, when he had been late for dinner, she had been nearly hypocritically. She took after with addition, whomping him with it as he stood, open-mouthed in the kitchen entryway, his wicker cereal with the rainbow trout in it at his feet. "Don't you ever scare me like that," she had screamed. Don't you ever. Each ever had been pronunciated by another dish rag swat. Mike had accepted his father to step and put a stop to it, but his father hadn't done so. Perhaps he knew if he did so would turn her wildcat anger on him as well. Mike had learned the lesson. One whomping with the dish rag was all it took. One before dark. "Yes, ma'am. Righto." He walked across the field toward the Titanic ruins, standing in the center. This was, of course, the remains of the Kitchener Iron Works. He had written past it, but had never thought to actually explore it, and he had never any kids saying that they had now stood in to examine a few tumble bricks that had formed a rough churn. He thought he could understand why. The field was dazzling bright, washed by sun from the spring sky. Occasionally, as a cloud passed before the sun, a great stuttering of shadow would travel slowly across the field. But there was something spooky about it all the same. A brooding silence that was broken only by the wind. He felt like an explorer who has found the last remnants of some fabulous lost city. Up ahead and to the right, he saw the rounded side of the massive tidal cylinder rising out of the high field grass. He ran over to it. It was the ironworks' main smokestack. He peered into its bore and felt a fresh chill warm up his spine. It was big enough so he could have walked into it if he had wanted it, but he didn't want to. God knew what strange guck there might be clinging to the smoke-backlit inner tiles, or what nasty bugs or beasts might have taken up residence inside. The wind gusted when it blew across the mouth of the fallen stack. It made a sound eerily like the sound of the wind vibratingly the wax strings. He and his dad put in a moose bowlers every spring. He stepped back nervously, suddenly thinking about the movie he had and his father had watched last night on the early show. It had been called Rodin, and watching it had seemed like great fun at the time. His father laughed and shouted, "Get the bird, Mikey!" every time Rodin made its appearance. Mike shooting with his finger until his mom popped her head in and told them to hush up before they gave her a headache with the noise. It didn't seem so funny now. In the movie, Rodin had been released from the bowels of the earth by these Japanese coal miners who had been digging the world's deepest tunnel and looking into the black bore of this pipe. It was all too easy to imagine that bird crouched at the far end, laughed back like wings, followed over its back, staring at the small, round boy face looking into the darkness, staring with its gold ring eyes. Shivering, Mike pulled back. He walked a ways down the smokestack, which had sunken into the earth to half of its circumference. The land rose slightly, and on an impulse, he scrambled his way up on top. The stack was a lot less scary on the outside, its tiled surface sun-warm. He got to his feet and strolled along, holding his arm. The surface was really too wide for him to need to worry about falling off, but he was pretending. He was a tight wire walker in the circus, like in the way the wind blew through his hair. At the far, he jumped down and began to examine stuff. More bricks, twisted molds, hunks of woods, pieces of rusty machinery. Bring back of Chevron, his father's note had said. He wanted a good one. He wandered closer to the mill's yawn cellar hold, looking at the debris, being careful not to cut himself on the broken glass. There was a lot of it around. Mike was unmindfully of the cellar hold, and his father's warning to stay out of it. Neither was he unmindful of the death that had been doubtful out of this spot 50-odd years before. He supposed that if there was a haunted place in Derry, this was it. But either in spite of that, or because of it, he was determined to stay until he found something really good to take back and show his father. He moved slowly and soberly toward the cellar hold, changing his course to purloin its rag side, when a warning voice inside whispered that he was getting too close, that a bank weakened by the spring rains could crumble under his heels, and pitched him into that hole where God only knew how much sharp iron might been waiting to impale him like a bug, leaving him to die a rusty, twitching death. He picked up a window sash, tossed it aside. Here was a deep here, big enough for a giant's table, its handle rippled and warped by some unimaginable flash of heat. Here was a piston too big for him to even budge, let alone lift. He stepped over it, and what if I had find a skull? He thought suddenly, the skull of one of the kids who were killed here while they were hunting for chocolate Easter eggs back in 19 whatever it was. He looked around the sun-washed, empty field, nastily shocked by the idea. The wind blew a low cocked note in his ears, and another shadow cruised silently across the field, like the shadow of a giant bat or bird. He became aware all over again of how quiet it was here, and now strange the field looked with its struggling piles of machinery and its belched iron hulks leaning this way and that. It was as if some horrid battle had been fought here long ago. Don't be such a dip, he replied uneasily to himself. They found everything there was of 50 years ago after it happened, and even if they didn't, some other could or grown up would have found the rest since then. Or do you think you're the only person who ever came here haunting for souvenirs? No, I don't think that, But what? That rainy national sight of his mind demanded, and Mike thought it was talking, just a little too loud, a little too fast. Even if there was still enough something to find, it would have decayed long ago. So what? Mike found a splintering desk drawer in the weeds. He glanced at it, tossed it aside, and moved a little closer to the cellar hold, where the stuff was thickness. Surely he would find something there. But what if there was a ghost? That's what, but what? What if I see hands coming over the edge of the cellar hold? And what if they start to come up, kids and the remains of the Easter Sunday clothes that are all rotten and torn and marked with 50 years of spring, mad and fall rain and caked winter snow. Kids with no heads. He had heard at school that after the explosion, a woman had found the head of one of the victims in the trees in her backyards. Kids with no legs. Kid flayed open like codfish. Kids just like me who would maybe came down and play. Down there where it's dark, under the leaning iron grinders and big old rusty cogs. Oh, stop it for the Lord's sake. But a thunder wrenched its way up his back, and he decided it was time to take something, anything, and get the dickens out of here. He reached down, almost at random, and came up with a great gear-toothed wheel, about 7 inches in diameter. He had pencil in his pocket, and he used it quickly to dig the dirt out of the teeth. Then he slipped his souvenir in his pocket. He would go now. He would go, yes, but his feet moved slowly in the wrong direction toward the cellar hole, and he realized with a dismal sort of horror that he needed to look down inside. He had to see. He gripped his spongy support beam, leaning out of the earth, and swayed forward, trying to see down inside. He couldn't quite do it. He had come to within 15 feet of the edge, but what that was still a little too far to see the bottom of the cellar hold. I don't care if I seen the bottom or not. I'm going back. I've got my souvenir. I don't need to look down into any old hole, and Daddy's note said to stay anyway from it. But the unhappy, almost ferocious curiosity that had gripped him would not to let go. He approached the cellar hold step by coincident step, aware that as soon as the wooden beam was out of his reach there would be no more grab holds, also aware that the ground here was indeed squelching and crumbly. In places along the edge, he could see depression like graves that had fallen in, and knew that they were the sites of previous caves in. Heart thudding in his chest like the hard, measured strides of a soldier's boots. He reached the edge and looked down, nested in the cellar hold. The bird looked up. Mike was not at first sure what he was seeing. All the nerves and pathways in his body seemed frozen, including those which conducted thoughts. It was not just the shock of seeing a monster bird, a bird whose breast wasn't as orange as a robin's and whose feathers were the unremarkable fluffy gray of a sparrow's feathers. Most of it was the shock of the utterly unexpected. He had expected marvelously a mandarin, half stubborage in stagnant puddles and black mud instead. He was looking down into a giant nest which filled the cellar hold from end to end and side to side. It had been made out of enough timidly grass to make a dozen bales of hay, but this grass was silvery odd. The bird sat in the middle of it, its brightly ranged eyes as black as fresh, warm tar, and for an insane moment before his personally broke, Mike could see himself reflected in each of them. Then the ground suddenly began to shift and run out of from beneath his feet. He heard the tearing sound of shallow roots giving way and realized he was sliding. With a yell, he threw himself backward, pinwheeling, his arms for balance. He lost it and thumped heavily to the litter ground. Some hard, dull chunk of metal pressed painfully into his back, and he had time to think of the tramp chair before he heard the whirring, explosive sound of the bird's wings. He scrambled to his knees, crawled, looked back over his shoulder, and saw it rising out of the cellar hole. Its scale and talons were a dusky orange, its beaten wings each more than 10 feet across blue, the scraggy timothy grass. This way and that parnously like the wind, generously by helicopter rotors. It uttered a buzzing, chirping and screaming. A few loose feathers slipped from its wings and splintered back down into the cellar hold. Mike gained his feet again and began to run. He pounded across the field, not looking back now, afraid to look back. The bird did not look like Rondon, but since it was the spirit of Rondon rising from the cellar hold of the kitchenery ironworks like a horrible bird in a box, he stumbled when to one knee, got up, and ran on. That weird, chirping, buzzing screech came again. A shadow cowered him, and when he looked up, he saw the thing. It had passed at less than 5 feet over his head. Its beak, dirty yellow, open and closed, revealing a pink linen inside. It whirled back toward Mike. The wind it generated washed across his face, bringing a dry, unpleasant smell with it attic dust. Dead anchorets, rotting cushions. He jigged to his left, and now he saw the fallen smokestack. Again, he spirited for it, running all out, his arms pumping in short, jabbing strokes at his sides. The bird screamed, and he heard its fluttering wings. They sounded like sails. Something slammed into the back of his head. Warm fire traced its way up the nape of his neck. He felt it spread as blood began to trickle down to the back of his shirt collar. The bird whirled around again, meaning to pick him up, and its talons and carry him away like a hawk with a field mouse, meaning to carry him back to its nest, meaning to eat him. As it flew at him, swooping down, its black, horribly alive eyes fixed on him, Mike cut sharply right. The bird missed him barely. The dusty smell of its wings was overpowering, unbearable. Now he was running parallelly to the fallen smokestack, its tail blurring by. He could see where it ended if he could reach the end and button hook. To the left, get inside. He might be safe. He thought that bird was too big to squeeze inside. He came very closely to not making it. The bird flew at him again, pulling up as it closed in, its wings flapping and pushing air in a hurricane. Its scaly talons now angled toward him and descended. It screamed again, and this time Mike thought he heard trumpeting in its voice. He lowered his head, put his arm up and ran straight forward, the talons close, and for a moment the bird had him by the forearm. The grip was like the clutch of incredibly strong fingers, tipped with tough nails. They bit like teeth. The bird's flapping wings were thunder in his ears. He was dimly aware of his father, fallen around him, some bushy past his cheeks. His phantom kisses, the bird rose them, and for a moment Mike felt like himself pulled upwards, first straight, then on tiptoe, and for one freezing second he felt the toes of his Kens lose contact with the earth. "Let me go!" he screamed at it and twisted his arm for a moment. The talons held, and then the sleeves of his shirt ripped. He thumped back down. The bird squallowed. Mike ran again, pushing through the thing's tail feathers, gagging at the dry smell. It was like running through a shower curtain of feathers, still coughing, eyes stinging from both tears and whatever vile dust coated the bird's feathers. He stumbled into the fallen smokestack. There was no thought now of what might be lurking inside. He ran into the darkness. He gasped in sobs, taken on the flat echo. He went back, perhaps 20 feet, and then turned toward the bright circle of daylight. His chest was rising and falling in quick jerks. He was suddenly aware that if he had misjudged either the sight of the bird or the size of the smokestack's muscle, he had killed himself as surely as if he had put his father's shotgun to his head and pulled the trigger. There was no way out. This wasn't just a pipe. It was blind alley. The other end of the stack was buried in the earth. The bird swallowed again, and suddenly the light at the end of the smokestack was blotted out as it lighted on the ground outside. He could see its yellow scaly legs, each as thick as a man's scalp. Then it cocked its head down and looked inside. Mike found himself again staring into those hideously bright, fresh tar eyes with their gold wedding rings of iris. The bird's beak opened and closed, and each time it snapped shut, he heard an audible click, like the sound you hear in your own ears when you snap your teeth together hard. Sharp, he thought. Its back is sharp. I guess I knew birds had sharp beaks, but I never really thought about it until now. It squawked again. The sound was so loud in the tile throat of the stack that Mike clapped his hand to his ears. The bird began to force itself into the mouth of the stack. "No!" Mike cried. "No, you can't!" The light faded as more of the bird's body pressed its way into the stack's bore. "Oh, my Lord, why didn't I remember it was mostly feathers? Why didn't I remember it could squeeze?" The light faded. Faded was gone. Now there was only an inky blackness, the suffocated attic smell of the bird, and the rustling sound of its feathers. Mike fell on his knees and began to grope on the curled floor of the smokestacks. His hands spread wide, feeling. He found a piece of broken tile, its sharp edges furred with what felt like moss. He cocked his arm back and pegged it. There was a thump. The bird uttered its chirping sound again. "Get out of here," Mike screamed. There was a silence, and then that crackled, rustling sound began again as the bird resumed forcing itself into the pipe. Mike fell along the floor, found other pieces of tile, and began to throw one after another. They thumped and thudded off the bird, and then clinked to the tile sleeve of the smokestack. "Please God," Mike thought incorrectly. "Please God, please God." It came to him that he ought to retreat down the smokestack's bore. He had run and through that had been the stack's base, and stood to reason that it would narrow as he backed up. He could retreat, yes, and listen to that low, dusty rustle as the bird worked its way in after him. He could retreat, and if he was lucky, he might get beyond the point where the bird could continue to advance. But what if the bird got stuck? If that happened, he and the bird would die in here together. They would die in here together and rot in here together. In the dark. Please God, he screamed, and was totally unaware that he had cried out aloud. He threw another piece of tidal, and this time his throne was more powerful. He told the others much later, as if someone were behind him at the moment, and that someone had given his arm a tremendous push. This time there was no fettering thud. Instead, there was a splatting sound, the sound of a kid's hand might make slapping into the surface of a bowl of half-solid jello. This time the bird screamed, not in anger, but in real pain. The tenderness of its wings filled the smokestacks, stinking air. Screamed past Mike in a hurricane, flapping his clothes, making him cough and gag and retreat as dust, and most flew. Light appeared against gray and weak at first, then brightening, a shifting as the bird retreated from the stack's muscle. Mike burst into tears, fell to his knees again, and began grubbing madly for more pieces of tidal. Without any conscious thought, he ran forward with both hands full of tiling. In this light, he could see the pieces were splotching with blue-gray moss and lichen like the surface of sleek gravestones. Until he was nearly at the mouth of the stack, he intended to keep the bird coming back if he could. It bent down, cocking its head the way a trained bird on a perch will sometimes cock its head, and Mike saw where his last shot and struck home. The bird's right eye was nearly gone. Instead of that glittering bubble of fresh tar, there was a cattered filled with blood, viscous gray, goo drip from the corner of the socket and trickled along the side of the bird's beak. Tiny parasites wiggled and squirmed in the pussy's discharge. It saw him and lunged forward. Mike began to throw chunks of tile at it. They struck its head and beaked and withdrew for a moment and then lunged again, beaked open, revealing that pink linen again, revealing something else that caused Mike to freeze for a moment. His own mouth dropping open. The bird's tongue was silver. Its surface was crazy cracked, as the surface of a volcanic land which has first baked and then slagged off. And on this tongue, like weird tumbleweeds that had taken temperable root there, were a number of orange puffers. Mike threw the last of his titles directly into the gaping maw, and the bird withdrew again, screaming in frustration, rage, and pain. For a moment, Mike could see its reptile talons. Then its wings ruffled the air, and it was gone. A moment later, he lifted his face, a face that was gray-brown under the dirt, dust, and bits of moss that the bird's wind machine wings had blown at him, toward the clicking sound of its talons on the tidal. The only clean places on Mike's face were the tracks that had been washed clean by his tears. The bird walked back and forth overhead. Tack, 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 tack. Mike retreated a bit, gathered up more chunks of tile, and heaped them as close to the mouth of the stack as he dared. If the thing came back, he wanted to be able to fire at it from point-blank range. The light outside was still bright now that it was May. It wouldn't get dark for a long time yet. But suppose the bird just decided to wait. Mike swallowed, the dry side of his throat rubbing together for a moment. Overhead, tack, tack, tack. It had a fine pile of a mountain now, in the dim light there, beyond the place where the angle of the sun made a shallow spiral inside the pipe. It looked like a pile of broken concrete swept together by a housewife. Mike rubbed the palms of his dirty hands along the side of his jeans and waited to see what would happen next. A space of time paused before something did. Whenever 5 minutes or 25, he could not tell. He was not only aware of the bird walking back and forth overhead like an enigmatic pace on the floor, at 3 in the morning. Then its wings fluttered again. It landed in front of the smokestacks open. Mike on his knees just behind his pile of the Talon began to peg missiles. As it before, it could even bend its head down of the slammed into a plated yellow leg and drew a trickle of blood, so dark it seemed almost as black as the bird's eyes. Mike screamed and trumpeted, the sound thin and almost lost under the bird's over-engaged squawk. "Get out of here," Mike cried. "I'm going to keep hitting you until you get out of here. I swear to God I will." The bird flew up to top of smokestack and resumed its pacing. Mike waited. Finally, its wings ruffled again as it took off. Mike waited, accepting the yellow feet, so like hen's feet, to appear again. They didn't. He waited longer, convincing it had to be some kind of a trick. Reanalyzing at last that wasn't why he was waiting at all. He was waiting because he was scared to go out, scared to leave the safety of this bolt hole. Never mind, stuff like that. I'm not a rabbit. He took as many chunks of title as he could, handling comfortably, then put some more inside his shirt. He stepped out of his smokestack, trying to look everywhere at once and wishing madly for eyes and back of his head. He saw only the field stretching around and around him, littering with the exploded Russian remains of the Kincherin ironworks. He keeled around, sure he would see the bird perched on the lips, on the stack, like a one-eyed vegetable now, only wanting the boy to see him before it attacked for the final time, using that sharp beak to jab and rip and strip. But the bird was not there. It was really gone. Mike's nerves snapped. He uttered a breaking scream of fear and ran for the weather-beaten fence between the field and the road, dropping the last piece of the tile from his hands. Most of the others fell out of his shirt as the shirt pulled free of his belt. He vaulted over the fence, one-handed like Roy Rogers, showing off for Dale Evans. On his way back from the choral with Pat Brady and the rest of the buckaroos, he grabbed the handlebars on his bike and ran in beside it, 40 feet up the road before getting on. Then he pedaled madly, not daring to look back, not daring to slow down, until he reached the intersection of Passerin Road and Outer Main Street, where there were lots of cars passing back and forth. When he got home, his father was changing the plugs on the tractor. We'll observe that Mike looked powerful, musty, and dusty. Mike hesitated for just a split second and then told his father that he'd taken a tumble from his bike on the way home, serving to avoid a pothole. "Did you break anything, Mikey?" Will asked, observing his son, and little more carefully. "No, sir." Sprains. Sure, Mike nodded. "Did you pick yourself a souvenir?" Mike reached into his pocket and found the gear wheel. He showed it to his father, who looked at it briefly and then puckled a tiny crumb of tillin from the pad of flesh just below Mike's thumb. He seemed more interested in this. "From that old smokestack?" Will asked. Mike nodded. "You go inside there?" Mike nodded again. "See anything in there?" Will asked it, and then, as if to make a joke of the question, which hadn't sounded like a joke at all, he added, "Buried treasure?" Smiled a little. Mike shook his head. "Well, don't tell your mother you was mucking about in there. Will said she shoot me first, and you second." He looked even more closely at his son. "Mikey, are you all right?" "Huh? You look a little peaky around the eyes." "I guess I might be a little tired," Mike said. "It's 8 or 10 miles there and back again. Don't forget you want some help with the tractor, Daddy." "Daddy?" "No, I'm not done screwing it up for this week. You go on and wash up." Mike started away, and then his father called to him once more. Mike looked back. "I don't want you going around that place again," he said. "At least not until all this trouble is cleared up. And then catch the main." "Who's doing it?" "You didn't see anybody." out there, did you? No one chased you or hollered you down? I didn't see any people at all, Mike said. Will nodded and lit a cigarette. I think I was wrong to send you there. Old places like that, sometimes, they can be dangerous. Their eyes locked briefly. Okay, Daddy, Mike said. I don't want to go back again. I'm back anyway. It was a little spooky. Will nodded again. Less said than better. I reckon you go and get cleaned up now and tell her to put on 3 or 4 extra sausages. Mike did. 6. Never mind that now, Mike Hanlon thought, looking at the grooves, which went up to the concerning edge of the canal and stopped there. Never mind that. It might just have been a dream, anyhow. And there were splotches of dried blood on the lips of the canal. Mike looked as these, and then he looked down into the canal. Black water followed smoothly past. Runners of dirty yellow from clutched to the canal's sides, sometimes breaking free to flow downstream. And lazy in curves for a moment, just a moment, 2 clots of this foam came together and seemed to form a face, a kid's face, its eyes turned up in an avatar of territory and agony. Mike's brief caught, as if on a thorn. The foam broke apart from meaninglessly again, and at that moment, there was a loud splash on his right. Mike snapped his head around, shrinking back a little, and for a moment he believed he saw something in the shadows off the shadows of the outflow tunnel where the canal refused after its course under downtown. Then it was gone, suddenly cold and stuttery. He dug in his pocket for the knife he had found in the grass. He threw it into the canal. There was a small splash, a ripple that began as a circle and was then tugged into shape of an arrowhead by the current, then nothing except the fear that was suddenly suffocated him, and then the deadly serenaded that there was something near, something watching him, gogging its chances, biding its time. He turned Mead into back and walked back to his bike. To run would be to dignify those fears and unidentify himself. And then that splashing sound came again. It was a lot louder this second time. So much for dignity. Suddenly he was running as fast as he could, beating his buns for the gate and his bike, jamming the kickstand up with one heel and pedaling for the street as fast as he could. That sea small that was all at once too thick, much too thick. It was everywhere, and the water dripping from the wet branches of the trees seemed much too loud. Something was coming. He heard dragging, lurching footsteps in the grass. He stood on the pebbles, giving it everything, and shot one onto Main Street. Without looking back, he headed for home as fast as he could, wondering what in hell had possessed him to come in the first place, what had drawn him. And then he tried to think about the chores, the whole chores, and nothing but the chores. After a while, he actually succeeded, and when he saw the headline in the paper the next day, "Missing Boys Prophet New Fears," he thought about the pocket knife he had thrown into the canal, the pocket knife with the essential EC scratched on the side. He thought about the blood he had seen on the grass, and he thought about those grooves which stop at the edge of the canal.